June 3rd, 2019, 24-year-old man in Hernando, Mississippi was contacted on Facebook by Jonathan Dansbury, real name Brandon Weber, who was interested in a car that the man in Mississippi had advertised online for sale or trade. The car was a red 2006 two-door Infiniti G35 with a value of $4,500. At around 9:30 that evening, Dansbury and his friend met with the seller in Hernando. Dansbury went with the seller for a test drive in the Infiniti while the other man waited in a black Nissan Maxima. After the test drive, however, Dansbury pulled a gun and shot the Hernando man multiple times. Dansbury then stole the Infiniti, leaving the victim for dead. The victim was airlifted to Regional 1 Health in Memphis in critical condition. He survived his gunshot wounds that included 2 in the back and 1 in the chest. It's a .22 caliber gun that was used. The shooter had identified himself as Jonathan Dansbury, but investigators found that the Facebook account that he had used to contact the Infiniti owner had been deleted soon after the shooting. Detectives were able to trace a phone text from Dansbury to Dansbury's close friend who was with him in Hernando for the shooting and the theft of the car. A week after the shooting, from his hospital bed, the victim identified Brandon Weber in a 6-person photo spread as the shooter. Felony arrest warrants were issued in Hernando, Mississippi on June 10th, 2019. Multiple felony warrants were issued in Mississippi for Weber's arrest. The charges included aggravated assault, manifesting extreme indifference to the value of human life, armed robbery, conspiracy to commit a felony, and grand larceny. The real name of Jonathan Dansbury is Brandon Weber. Mississippi detectives determined that Brandon Weber lived in Memphis. Mississippi detectives called on the U.S. Marshals Gulf Coast Regional Fugitive Task Force for assistance in the apprehension of Weber. The U.S. Marshals Gulf Coast Regional Task Force is a multi-agency task force with divisions in Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Their mission is to arrest violent offenders and sexual predators. The task force got to work gathering information on Brandon Weber. They learned that he had several residences where he might be found. They also found Facebook postings of him driving around and showing off his newly acquired Infiniti. The marshals considered Weber to be armed and dangerous. In an online video with no sound, Weber is seen driving and shows a pair of magazine clips taped together near the front seat console. The video also shows bullets in the top of the magazines. Hours before task force members arrived, Weber was on Facebook laughing and taunting police as he talked into his cell phone camera.
Come on, he just hooked his thing. The police. Oh God, look at this bitch. I'm bad, man. You got to kid me up. You got to kid me up. Me and God ain't gonna fuck to him. And they turn that dumb ass around his arm. This shit gonna be fun. Y'all really nigga. You gotta turn that ass up.
At around 6 p.m. on June 12, 2019, federal marshals began a roving stakeout of 2075 Durham Avenue in Fraser, the home of Weber's grandmother. Federal marshals were in unmarked SUVs and F-150 trucks that were equipped with red and blue emergency lights that could be activated if necessary. At around 6:15 p.m., Weber arrived in the stolen red Infiniti, which he backed into the driveway and remained seated in the driver's seat. By radio, the marshals quickly developed a plan to take him into custody. They decided on a vehicle pin with two F-150 trucks pulling into the driveway side by side and up to the smaller Infinity's front bumper to prevent escape. From a nearby staging area, the marshals put on ballistic vests and helmets which identified them clearly as law enforcement. The trucks activated their emergency lights, quickly pulled into the driveway bumper to bumper with the stolen Infinity. A third vehicle driven by law enforcement, blocked from the driver's side. Weber tried to back up but had nowhere to go. He revved the engine, he went forward. He struck the front bumper of a marshal's truck. They were yelling repeatedly at him to turn the car off. He refused. Two marshals got out and approached the driver's side of the Infinity, ordering Weber to surrender, ordering him to get out of the car. He refused. They repeatedly said, "Show me your hands." They repeatedly identified themselves as law enforcement. They repeatedly asked him to get out of the car, and he refused. Weber then leaned to the passenger side and pulled out this. And I'm going to ask Chief Phillips to come up. That was in Weber's passenger side. He reached for it, pointed it at the officers. One or both of the marshals then shouted, "Gun, gun, gun," and began retreating from the red Infinity. They were firing their weapons as they were moving back. Three other marshals that were surrounding also began firing from near their trucks. There were an additional 3 marshals on the scene who were not in position to fire. It was undetermined whether Weber was able to fire his fully loaded weapon before a bullet struck it and rendered it inoperable. What we do know is that the safety was off, there was a round in the chamber, and there were 2 loaded magazine clips also in the car. In total, there were 38 rounds. Picture of the stolen Infinity with the firearm outside of it, and the back end of the red Infinity with a false license plate that was registered to a Kia Rio. That's a close-up of the gun you just saw here this afternoon on the driveway on Durham Avenue. The gun in the Facebook post is the same gun on the side of the car on Durham Avenue. Marshals pulled Weber from the car and performed chest compressions until the paramedics arrived. He was pronounced dead at the scene at 6:55 p.m. An autopsy determined that he had been shot 17 times. 2 fatal wounds to the head, 2 each to the left arm, left thigh, right thigh, 3 in the left knee, 1 each in the left wrist, left thumb, right forearm, right wrist, left hip, and right calf. Toxicology reports showed measurable amounts of amphetamine, methamphetamine, and marijuana in Brandon Weber's system. Since 2015, there has been a memorandum of understanding in place among our office, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and local law enforcement. Anytime an officer is involved in a fatal shooting, the district attorney is called. I then call the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to conduct an investigation. That happened in this case, and that investigation was done by the TBI, and a report submitted to the District Attorney General's office. It is my responsibility to determine if criminal laws have been broken. That is my sole determination, not whether civil liability exists or whether policies and procedures of the U.S. Marshal Service have been violated. The The sole determination of the DA's office is whether criminal state laws have been broken, and if so, by whom. To make that determination, as with every decision we make in this office, we look to the law and we look to the facts. First, the law. 3911-620, Tennessee Code Annotated, gives an officer the right to use deadly force. It says that a law enforcement officer, after giving notice of being a law enforcement officer, may use or threaten to use force that is reasonably necessary to accomplish an arrest of anyone who is suspected of a criminal act, who either resists that arrest or tries to flee. In this situation, as we've talked about, the officers had vests and helmets that identified themselves as law enforcement. They themselves identified themselves as law enforcement. They activated their emergency lights. They tried to break, or rather to surround his car and keep him from being able to go anywhere and to safely remove him from that car. In addition to that, they had a warrant signed by a judge in Mississippi. The statute goes on to say that law enforcement officers may use deadly force to make an arrest only if all other reasonable means have been exhausted or are unavailable, and the officer has probable cause to believe that the person has committed a felony involving the infliction or threatened infliction of serious bodily injury, or that the officer has probable cause to believe the person poses a threat of serious bodily injury either to the officer or to others, unless immediately apprehended. Again, they blocked his car. They asked him repeatedly to turn the car off and get out. Instead, he reached for a gun. These officers knew that in the last week, he had shot a man 5 times over a car. He had also, just hours before this, made multiple threats to law enforcement. When confronted by the 2 officers trying to remove him safely from the stolen car, Brandon Weber's first reaction was to grab a fully loaded weapon and point it at the officers. The safety was off his weapon, and he had 38 rounds in it. The law does not require that law enforcement wait to be fired upon. These marshals were hoping to take a suspected violent offender into custody quickly and safely with the element of surprise. They also were under a heightened sense of caution that afternoon because of his past violent actions and his current social media posts threatening and challenging the police. When evaluating whether an officer's use of deadly force was reasonable in a given situation, our United States Supreme Court has said that that evaluation must be judged from the perspective of the reasonable officer on the scene, not with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. The calculus of reasonableness, the Supreme Court goes on, must embody allowance for the fact that police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary in a particular situation. Given the actions of Brandon Weber, the marshals had no time to weigh any other options. While any loss of life is tragic, the facts and evidence of this case and the law of the state of Tennessee lead to no other conclusion than the one that I have made, that the U.S. Marshals were justified in responding with lethal force in this situation. 1 week earlier, Brandon Weber had shown he had little regard for human life and would have no hesitation in shooting the marshals rather than surrender. Our standard for prosecution on every case that our office handles is that we must have a reasonable likelihood of conviction. That means, given all the facts, all of the evidence, the law that might apply, and any and all possible defenses, can we prove our case beyond a reasonable doubt? There are no criminal charges that could be filed against these U.S. Marshals that would meet that standard for prosecution. Again, my decision is based upon Tennessee criminal law only. It does not consider policies, procedures, or training requirements of the United States Marshal Service. My decision does not apply to disciplinary policies or to civil liability. My sole job is to determine if criminal laws of the state of Tennessee were broken by the U.S. Marshals. My finding is that none were, and no indictments will be sought from the Shelby County Grand Jury. And with that, I'll open it up briefly to questions.
Talk a little bit about the weapon that Brandon Weber had. You said it was loaded, but he wasn't able to fire the shots?
We don't know, because someone shot at that gun and rendered it inoperable, probably one of the marshals, but the safety was off. There was a round in the chamber, and there were 37 other rounds close by Brandon Weber in the magazine clips.
So if he did pull it, then it wouldn't have worked. He pulled the trigger. Or explain that again, I'm sorry.
Well, nobody's certain when it was rendered inoperable. Right. The officers shot at it, and that's probably when it was rendered inoperable. Right. It was operating fine before the marshal shot at it when it was pointed at them.
Oh, shot the weapon, okay.
Any other questions? We are going to, as you all know, this will be on our office website. We're gonna do what we can to get it posted this afternoon. If there are technical difficulties, it may be, Monday. Yes, ma'am?
Could you describe a little bit more about the repeated, declaration of the officers? It sounds like, with their element of surprise that you described, that may have been, a quick identification. Could you talk a little bit more about what your investigation found in that regard?
Sure. I mean, bear in mind that this all happened very quickly, but they surrounded his car. They tried to get him to get out of it by identifying themselves and asking him to turn the car off and to get out. He refused. They approached the car to open the door and to pull him out.
Right, and so
That
I guess
is when-
the time frame of that, did your investigation reveal any?
Oh, I don't, I'm sure it's discernible from the video, or not the videos rather, but the information that's in the file, but I don't remember off the top of my head that length of time. But this all happened very quickly. There's no
Right,
doubt
I
about
guess,
that.
yeah, more so, is the element of surprise justified in that sense? Do you think that it gave enough time to use that, way to, complete the arrest, to give enough time to understand that they were law enforcement?
They identified themselves as law enforcement. They were wearing helmets and vests that identified themselves as law enforcement. They said, "We are law enforcement." They said repeatedly, "Show us your hands, get out of the car, show us your hands, police, get out of the car." But remember, the reason this apprehension was taking place the way it was because of the violent tendencies that he had exhibited a week before in Mississippi, and because of the Facebook posts that they were aware of from hours before, where he's making the statements that you all saw earlier.
And so in interviews with his family, Weber's mother has, said that she and her family noticed unmarked cars outside the house prior to 6 p.m. Did the investigation conclude that any of that was true, or whether that would have, sort of prompted any of the Facebook posts that were made?
I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Annette Pegler with Local 24 News here. I heard you say that Brandon Weber was shot multiple times in different areas of his body. As the Shelby County District Attorney, do you believe that that force was appropriate in that manner to, I guess, apprehend the threat?
Which is why the law says what it does, and the Supreme Court opinion mentions that it's, what we cannot do as prosecutors is look at this case and look at what happened in that driveway today. We have to look at it through the eyes of reasonable law enforcement officers on the scene at the time, using the force that is necessary to make an apprehension, but at the same time, what changed in this situation was the suspect grabbing a gun, the gun that you saw, pointing it at the officers. And now they have a decision and a right and a responsibility to protect themselves and to protect the people around them. So, second guessing the amount of force that's needed is not my job. My sole responsibility is to determine if criminal laws were broken. Anything else?
how
Yes,
many?
oh, sorry, yes, ma'am.
How many marshals again were there, and I guess, I'm assuming they're placed on a temporary leave, and now they're ready to go back to work, what's the next step?
I don't know, that's up to the marshals to determine that, we don't make those decisions, there were 8 on the scene total. Yeah, yes, sir, in the back.
So you said the safety was off and the gun was rendered useless by, fire from the officers. Is there any, so there's no evidence that he actually fired the gun? Is that what you're saying?
We don't know. Right.
No. And where we see the gun lying here in the picture, was that placed there by the officers, or is that how it just came out in the aftermath? Did it,
It's my understanding that that's where it landed, yes, sir.
that's where it landed, okay.
All right, yes, ma'am.
Annette Pegler with Local 24 again. Was it just one marshal who noticed the gun, or did all of the marshals on the scene notice that weapon in his car?
There was multiple screaming of gun, gun, gun. I don't know how many of the marshals screamed that or saw it, but it was
Okay.
more than one, yeah. Remember, they were, again, approaching, they were very close to the car, trying to get him out of the car, and that's when the gun was pointed in their direction. And they retreated, yelling, gun, 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 and that's when the shots started.
How many of the marshals were firing, do we know?
5. The 2 that were trying to approach the car, and then the 3 that were in close enough proximity to do so safely.
I wanted to ask really quick if there are any concerns about what the community response might be to this. I know last year when this shooting took place, there was a lot of unrest as a result.
Of course, we don't take our decisions lightly in any decision that we make in our office. I've met with the family in this case, and it's a loss of life. It's a tragic loss of life. And I hope that what the community will listen to, I hope what the community will hear are the facts as they were presented to our office. And I hope what they will hear me saying is we take our responsibility very seriously. And every tragic loss of life does not equal a criminal prosecution.
And just to clarify, was just the marshals that were there, or who else was there?
U.S. Marshals, that was it, yes ma'am. Yeah. Yes ma'am.
My last question, the Facebook posts that were made by Mr. Weber, how was that made aware to the U.S. Marshals?
Through their investigation. I think, they're gathering information, they're trying to figure out what different addresses he might be located at. They were doing an investigation that any law enforcement officer would do before planning an apprehension and an issuance of this arrest warrant. So through their research and work, yeah.
Okay.
All right, well, we appreciate you all being here today, and we'll get it up on the website as soon as we can. Anything else? I'm looking at my 18 here. All right, thank you.